Recording is on, I believe. It's not telling me that it is. Can somebody else confirm to me that recording is on?
It is
Yeah.
on.
Confirm.
Okay, thank you. All right, well, it's my honor really to introduce today's speaker, Richard Atkinson. And yet, it is the Richard Atkinson you're thinking of. He, just to remind you, he was a professor at Stanford University, where with his then student Richard Schifrin, he developed the Atkinson-Schifrin model in 1968. It might be the most influential model in all of experimental psychology. It is still going strong today. It organizes the first half of my entire class on memory and amnesia. It was the subject of a special issue in Memory and Cognition a couple years ago, recognizing 5 decades of research that it has inspired. After Stanford, or while at Stanford, he was the director of the National Science Foundation for 5 years. Then he went on to be the chancellor of, some of you might not know, UC San Diego. And then after that, went on to be president of the entire UC system. He is an elected member of the American Academy of Arts and Sciences, the National Academy of Sciences, the American Philosophical Society, and the National Academy of Medicine, among many other honors that I won't spend time listing because he doesn't want me to. He also is, when you're in Warren College and you walk by Atkinson Hall, he's the Atkinson on that building. So, okay, without further ado, I'm going to turn it over to him. I'm going to be here to help if need be. But if we were in a room, you could all clap and warmly welcome him, but just imagine not clapping, that's the best we can do.
Thanks. Can you get back a little?
Yeah.
Thanks very much, John. This is going to be a very informal talk, and I'll stick around as long as anyone has questions at the end. So let me begin by saying that I'm not really, it's not going to be a technical talk. It's really a little more than sort of a review of the history of the Atkinson-Schifrin model and a little of the background. I am going to make a few personal remarks to start with, but I think they will tie in directly to the comments about the Atkinson-Schifrin model. I was an undergraduate at the University of Chicago. While there, I worked with a man named Nicholas Reshevsky. He was quite famous at the time. He was a physicist who believed that the future of biology and psychology would mimic the future of physics. And so he was building formal models, mathematical models of biological processes, but one of them was neural networks. And what I did as an undergraduate was make computations on a hand calculator, nothing more. There were no computers in those days, on his early models of neural nets. But I mean, my plan was to go on for a PhD in the Committee on Mathematical Biology at the University of Chicago. But about that time, I heard a lecture by Bill Estes. I was swept away. Bill was a young faculty member at Indiana University, and what he was doing at the time were models for simple types of animal learning, but the models were stochastic in character. I had never been aware of stochastic models in the earlier work that I'd done, and I was really swept away with what he was doing. And I found myself the next fall as a doctoral student at Indiana University working with Bill Estes. During my 4 years at Indiana, I've really focused on the early stages of the development of stimulus sampling theory. And I don't know how well known that theory is at this point in history, but it was certainly a very important model in the 50s and 60s. And I did a thesis called A Stochastic Model for Rote Serial Learning. I'm rather proud of that thesis because it dates back to Ebbinghaus, and it dates back to Hull's theories. None of you probably have ever seen the Hullian book published in 1940, A Mathematico-Deductive Theory of Rote Learning. And then there's my thesis, there's the Atkinson-Shiffrin theory. And during the pandemic, I've been writing a little model using the Atkinson-Shiffrin theory as the basis of redoing a reanalysis of my doctoral thesis. So when I was in graduate school, the Korean War had broken out, and I was eligible for the draft. My draft board said you have exactly 4 years to finish your PhD. I finished my PhD in '54 and was drafted into the Army. It was one of the luckiest days of my life. I won't go through any detail there except to say that I ended up at the Naval Postgraduate School in Monterey, California, as a private in the Army. But I worked for 2 years in the computer laboratory there. Now, this is 1954, and you may find it hard to believe, but in those days, there probably weren't more than 3 or 4 universities in the United States, maybe 4 or 5, that actually had access to a computer. There were none. It was before the IBM 650. There were just a handful of computers. And here I was in this laboratory, which had a machine, actually a National Cash Register machine. And I spent my 2 years in the Army learning how to program, learning how to run a computer. But what was more interesting is that the guy who was running that laboratory was very inventive, and he was using the computer to literally play games. Now you might think, well, that's nothing unique. Well, let me tell you, in 1954, the idea of using a computer to play games was a pretty novel perspective. So my 2 years in the Army, I go to Stanford, and I'm going to skip forward. I won't describe my early life at Stanford. I'm going to skip forward now to the year 1965. And here is the Institute for Mathematical Studies in the Social Sciences at Stanford University at just about the time that Rich is there. And what's unique about this institute, from my perspective, is that we have a PDP-1 computer. Now, if you were what's this here?
That's fine.
Oh, so it had a PDP-1 computer now, and that computer was produced in 1960. It was the first of its kind. It was a transistorized computer. It was set up so that it was a time-sharing system, so that many people could run on the computer at the same time. And the reason we had that computer was that we were carrying out research on computer-based instruction. Here is an example of the computer system as Rich arrived. You can see we were connected out to Washington, D.C., Seattle, all over the country. This was before the days of the internet. It was on phone lines, and we were running computerized instruction programs and reading and mathematics, early grades, over a wide network of schools and groups. But that PDP-1 computer made it possible for us to do things that couldn't have been done without it. And I think in one of our early papers, we indicate that without the availability of that computer, where we had top priority on it, we would not have been able to do some of the things that we did. So that's the story of our situation when Rich arrives. By the way, the Institute for Mathematical Studies of the Social Sciences was sort of a center for activity throughout the country in mathematical models. The mathematical model development was sort of in the 50s and 60s. Everyone who was doing work of that sort would visit Stanford. We had summer institutes where people would spend the summers. Chomsky, George Miller, Bush, Mosteller, they were all out at the Institute at various times. It was a very exciting time. Rich arrives in at my lab in 1965. He's just finished 1 year as a graduate student. Just how we got together is another story, but simply put, we were both interested in similar phenomena. And the phenomenon that was of particular interest to us was the issue of free recall experiments. Let me just describe what I mean by a free recall experiment. It's not going forward.
Can we do that? Okay, is that the slide you want?
Yeah. So by free recall experiment, I mean, I think we're all familiar with it, but let me just bring everybody up to date. The experiment that I have in mind is you hear a series of words one after the other, and at the end of the series, you're asked to recall all the words you can in the series. And what you get is a beautiful U-shaped curve. The most recent items presented are well recalled. The very early items are not as well recorded, but reasonably well recorded. And in the middle of the list, there's a shallower period. So you have this nice U-shaped function. And it was that type of experiment that sort of focused on the idea of this ordering of input and how one might deal with that ordering of input in developing a model for remembering a list of items like that. And we came up with the first model, which we call the buffer model. And it's a kind of interesting model. It's described here in this figure. It has a series, you have a box with a series of slots. The first word that's presented goes into the first slot. The second word that's presented comes in and pushes the first one down. The third word pushes the two down and is sitting in the top of the stack. And finally, when all the slots are filled, all the additional words as they come in will cause one of the words already in the buffer to be popped out. So that's the model that we had. And the idea was that the items as they came into the buffer would be transmitting information to some storage device. We called it a long-term store. We never used the word short-term. We did not use the word short-term memory in the early stage. It was just simply the buffer. The buffer was interacting with long-term store. And as long as an item was in the buffer, it would be recalled immediately if tested. On the other hand, if the item was early on, it was probably out of the buffer, and then there'd have to be a search of long-term memory because there was a theta process that would cause an image of the item to be placed in long-term store. And so we had that. We moved to fit that to some data. And this was a little experiment that had been done by a postdoc in my lab. This is what Rich and I first looked at. And here is the set of data. And what you see there are the predictions from the theory. And it's based on 3 parameters. One, the size of the buffer. In this case, I think it was 5. The theta parameter, which still sent information into long-term store. And then another parameter that determined how items would exit the buffer, with the idea being that when the buffer was full, if a new item came in, it could just pop another item out at random, but it tended to pop items out that were older than earlier, but still pretty much in a random way. So that led to the set of predictions. But after we did that, we wrote a paper, which I'll call the Princeton paper. And that was written in it was a technical report. Let's see, how do I get to the next one? It was a technical report. And this is another point I want to make. You'll see that's a technical report in the psychology series of the Institute for Mathematical Studies and the Social Sciences. It's technical report 79. There's another set of tech reports in economics, but here is the psychological collection of tech reports. And those are all on my internet, all the tech reports. It's kind of interesting because if I had to rely on just looking at earlier publications, I'd probably have a little different perspective on what was going on. So here is the first tech report. It was prepared for a symposium at Princeton University that occurred in October of 1965, just a few months after we began our partnership in developing this theory. And it's quite a remarkable paper. It's 88 pages long. We do not introduce the concept of short-term memory directly. We have a long-term store. We designate it as called long-term store, and we have the buffer. And we use the buffer and the long-term store to fit a number of studies, paired associate learning studies, and the kind of study that I just described. And the fits were really quite good. And when I presented the model at the Princeton Symposium, people got quite a kick out of the notion of a buffer with these items popping out. Maybe I didn't describe it very well, but one version of it was we had these items popping out of the buffer into long-term memory. And then the early models that we had, which were described in some detail in this paper, the Princeton paper. It's a long paper, was never published. The results of the symposium were published, but there was only a sort of small bit of information about the buffer itself and its application to a few examples. But the paper is quite interesting because we offer a number of different models there. And what's interesting about the models is that there's a great emphasis on search and retrieval. That is, the idea was that the items as they popped out of the buffer would end up in long-term store. And there was a search process to retrieve those in order to respond to the test situation. So in that paper, we have three models of search and retrieval from the long-term store. And then we just have a very simple model that just simply says the longer the items in the buffer, the greater the strength of the item in long-term memory. And it's just simply an exponential function of time in the buffer. And it turns out that the best fitting model is the simplest model. So if you go back to that buffer slide again, you'll see a little function in there called theta. And that's simply summarized in a way the search and retrieval process in a single number. And that probably was a mistake to walk away from that so quickly, but the fit was so good with just the simple long-term store activity that we sort of sat with it for a period of time. So if you look at the Princeton paper, it's on my website. I just put it up there recently. It's a long paper, 88 pages, just ream full with equations, Poisson distributions, everything. It's quite an interesting paper. And there are three models that are described, four models that are described, three with different schemes for search and retrieval of items once in the buffer, once in long-term store, and then the simple incremental model that we end up focused on. So there's no mention at the time of control processes. There is some discussion about decay processes, and we argue that we're just going to ignore any possibility of decay of information in long-term memory until we're forced to change that assumption. And here we are, 57 years later, and we still haven't walked away from that assumption. Although I gather there's some work that Bob York is doing now that is causing people to think twice about it. But in any event, the model that we had at that time had no decay process in it. That kicked off a whole series of experiments, and these experiments are really quite interesting. And the next slide is the first of the group, and it's published in the Journal of Mathematical Psychology. And I'm not going to try to explain the details of the experiment. You're simply keeping track of certain stimuli and the appropriate response for that stimulus. But this is, I think, what was unique for that period in time. There were, in this study, for example, there are 9 students. They are 9 Stanford students, and they run for 10 days on the computer, an hour per day. So it's a pretty rigorous task for them. But what we have is just an incredible collection of data under absolutely idealized conditions. No one's involved. You just sit at the terminal. You've got your 50 minutes fully defined by the sequence of events that the computer generates. Again, today that wouldn't sound like a very interesting way of, or very unique, but it truly was unique. And if you look at the multi-process model paper that I have up here, you'll see that it's just, as was in the original tech report, it's ream full of equations, just equation after equation. Now, we're now at a point where we've had a number of early papers. We've have a number of these experiments underway. In fact, almost actually completed, when I'm invited to submit a paper to a annual volume of work in learning and memory, and that becomes the paper that's best known. And I want to show you the human memory, a proposed system and its control processes. Now, I kept emphasizing that these early papers are just packed with equations. The first half of this paper, there's not a single equation. In the next half of the paper, there may be 3 lines of maybe 3 equations of 1 line each. Absolutely, virtually no mathematics. What's happened? Well, in the first section of the paper, we finally lay out the theory in some detail. And then the theory, of course, has 3 components: a system with a sensory register, a short-term store, and a long-term store. We do not want to use the term short-term memory. I'll get back to that in a minute. So there are that's the system, so to speak. These 3 memories: a short-term register with a very brief millisecond type memory, the short-term store, and then the long-term store, which is a relatively permanent store. The first half of the paper simply reviews the concepts of these 3 structures and the flow of information through them. The next section, control processes, indicates that how the information flows through the system depends on the control processes in effect. Now, that doesn't seem like a big step forward, but suddenly we had a very clear view that there was the system, and then there were the set of control processes, and that in different experiments and under different conditions, different, you have the same system, the same capability of moving information between these stores, but it would depend on the actual control process. And that the first section is rather interesting. That is the first three sections of the paper, because not an equation, just simply a review of just a whole range of research. Just about anyone who was doing research in those days, their paper would be in there. The results of their paper would be in there and indicate how it would fit into this system, so to speak. And we talk about the notion that it's really a general theory, and we've always used the term general theory because it's not specific, it's not detailed at the level of the description of the system. It's only possible to develop a mathematical model if one is willing to define the control processes that govern that system. And of course, the buffer was sort of a special type of control process that could be established in the framework of short-term memory to deal with the free recall type situation. So that is the characterization of the model in 1968. And by the way, Rich and I spent only 3 years together, because when this paper is done and his doctoral dissertation is done, he's off to Indiana University. That would be sometime in the fall of 1968. And so where I go from here is going to be, I think, a little interesting, because up until then, we'd been very closely involved in work together. So this activity is represented then in the human memory paper, the system and control processes, and it gets an incredible amount of attention. It's a few months, if we can do that, in 1971, there was an article in Scientific American, and you can see here that it has the sensory register with the various components, the short-term store, various coding, so on, and then the long-term memory. What do I want to say about that? Why were we so reluctant, or the naming of the short-term store? Why didn't we just call it short-term memory? In the paper, the 68 paper, we do use the term working memory, but we discard that as a term, as an appropriate term for the short-term store. The reason, I think, is that when we were just starting this work, people thought in terms of short-term memory and long-term memory, but the perspective was really the perspective that came out of really in 19th century philosophy in England, and Wundt and his workers in Germany. The idea was there were two types of memories. If you had a memory in your consciousness, you were conscious of a memory, that was a short-term memory. There were other memories where you weren't conscious of them, but if you were lucky, you could retrieve them and stuff them into short-term memory. And so that was sort of the distinction. There was short-term memory phenomena and there were long-term memory phenomena. But the idea of this specific process of moving information from short-term memory into long-term memory was, I think, somewhat unique at the time. What's very clear is that we spend a lot of time talking about the nature of the short-term store, the fact that it is so variable. It can be set up in so many different ways. And that's something that a lot of people have never quite captured the idea of, but that there was great flexibility. So the Scientific American article, it was one of the most reproduced articles in the history of the Scientific American up to that point in time. And just about every book of readings for the next 20 years had that article in it. Now this is a little pompous on my part, but I was also the author of along with Jack Hilgard, of the most popular book in introductory psychology. And in the next edition, the 1969 edition, the memory chapter was built around the general theory. And so there we are. Over time, there are a lot of critics, and some are some very serious criticisms, some experiments that did seem to be a real problem for the theory to handle. I won't review all of that. I'm just going to pop forward to a paper in 2012 by Ken Melberg and his student. And what he does in that paper, and which was one of the first papers that I read when I finally retired, was examine these various criticisms, and there are a number that were out there and had gotten a lot of attention. And basically, my view of his paper is that he takes the buffer model, and you see it's in the title of the paper, and restructures the buffer model to indicate the kinds of flexibility that it had in terms of processing information, that it could be in one mode or another mode, or part of the short-term memory could be in one mode and the other part in a different mode. The point being that it's a very dynamic system for processing information. And he then proceeds to develop a series of models for each of these critical situations and collects a huge amount of data. And it confirms the earlier studies, but the data just is fit like a glove by the models that he offers. So that was quite an important paper from my view. We're now at the year 1968. Rich goes off to Indiana University. I'm still hanging around until 1975, and I want to get to that period. I'm not going to say after 1975, some really dramatic events occur, and from my perspective, in the development of the theory, and I'm going to get to that very shortly. Obviously, those events are directly tied to Rich and his various students and postdocs. I think they're quite stunning, and I will get to those shortly, but I'm now going to pop back. Rich is gone. I continue to have students who work on in the framework of the theory. I think there were 10 theses that were done on that computer system using the program that was used here in this particular study. And now where am I? Let me see where the next slide is. But I'm now focused on the whole issue of retrieving information from long-term memory. And I start doing experiments where you have a subject who learns a list of words, a short list or even a long list, 20 items, learns them perfectly. So there's never any question about being able to recall the list. And then he's put in the laboratory and words one by one are flashed up. Some were on the list, some were not on the list. And the question is, how quickly can he say yes or no, yes on the list or not on the list? And of course, in a situation like that, accuracy is virtually perfect, but speed of response does vary. And what we found out was that the speed of response is really mixed. It can be a fast response or a slow response. So what you're looking at is a distribution of latencies where the underlying system is generating very fast responses on some occasions and very slow responses on other occasions. And that led me to what some people have called the dual processing model. It's been used in quite a few areas of psychology of late. I kind of love the model. Basically, there's a distribution. We have this idea of familiarity that sometimes during the search process in long-term memory, certain items are more familiar or seem very familiar. And they seem so familiar that even though the search hasn't been completed, you are prepared to say yes very quickly. And there are other items in another distribution that are the lures that are not on the list, where your familiarity was so minimal so quickly that you're willing to say, no, it's not on the list. But then there's this intermediate range with these two criteria, C0 and C1, where in that middle section, you engage in a search. And so there are various search processes mixed in there, but not very sophisticated ones, but it gives a very, very good view of what happens, because by varying the criteria, varying list length, varying a number of variables, and manipulating the criteria, you can get a beautiful fit to a wide range of data. So this is 1975. At this point, I leave the field, and I never thought I was leaving. I thought I was leaving for a year, and never did come back. This is one of the few days I've ever sat in the psychology building, for example, here at UCSD. In any event, quite a few people then begin doing or are doing experiments in recognition memory, or let me say memory involving a search of long-term memory. And Rich and his students get very involved in that. And I think I would put it this way: Rich looked at something like the dual process model that I proposed. And so, and by the way, I should add, this concept of familiarity is very much related to George Mandler. And I'm just looking at George Mandler's hall from this window. So I should talk about George in all of this, but I just don't have time at this point. But in any event, this dual process model with the fast, slow responses, I think Rich thought, what is this nonsense of familiarity? Where does that come from? Where does that emerge in the Atkinson-Shiffrin theory? And that's where Rich begins to, what's this? Let's see, let's do the next one. Oh, this is just a little more of the dual process model flow chart for the whole issue. I won't worry about it. But so there is a very active program of research that goes on for a long time, still very active in the field. And that's the issue of the search of long-term memory. And if you go back to the original 1979 paper, we talk a lot about search processes. How one kicks off a search process, how long does it go on for? If you find something, how do you decide whether it's what you want? And if you're unsuccessful, when do you turn off the search? And all of that was in everyone's thinking, but Rich and his various students in the first shot at this have a model called SAM, search of associated memory. And SAM is really quite stunning in the sense that it not only can account for recognition memory, but it can account for recall memory. It can account for short versus long response times, because in the nature of the search, as you're attempting to make this match between the search queue and the actual stored image, there is a computation, and the computation is at a certain point where it's so far along that you want to say yes right away, even though you haven't reached the stored item, or you want to say no right away because there's nothing that seems to be moving in the direction of a successful search. And so with that, a whole range of phenomena are developed. It's, I guess, maybe 30 years of research. I don't have the dates right in mind at the moment. A little later, Rich and his students developed what they call the REM model, retrieving effectively from memory. And those two models are just quite stunning in terms of the range of data that they can account for, and not only the typical type of research, but also some other types of research that involve the sensory register. And so we arrive at a point in time where all of this simply fits together in a beautiful form, all within the framework of, again, I'm going to say the general theory, but where the general theory is evolved into the elegance of the SAM model and the REM model. And so you might say, well, how can you say that you have such a sweeping conclusion about the state of search and retrieval processes? Well, if I could have the next slide, I can say it because I've just recently finished reading chapter 2 of a book. The book's in preparation, and it's being done by Ken Malberg, who's a professor at the University of South Florida. He worked very closely with Rich for a number of years as a postdoctoral fellow. He's run a very active laboratory for many years. The Malberg paper I mentioned a little earlier is just one of many, many papers. And he is now in the process of writing a book. And the title of the book, it's tentative, but the general human memory, the general theory and its various models. And what I like about this book is that it's very much like the 68 paper. There are very few equations. Now, how can you write a book about a mathematical model, so to speak, without equations? Well, again, it's describing all the foundations that are underlie the general theory, but relying on the requirement of, without going through all the detail of building every model, simply relying on published studies and the indication that with this model you can do that and so forth. In any event, there is the list of chapters. I've read 7 of them. I think they are absolutely brilliant. I'm just tickled pink with what's been done. And I'm really kind of intrigued because I haven't seen the last chapter yet. I hope to see it fairly soon. But there again, we return to the 1965 paper, The Buffer. And again, here we have it, the buffer model revisited. And I think that revisit is again, an emphasis on just how crucial short-term memory is to everything that takes place. I retired in 2003 from the presidency of the University of California. But for the next 10 years, I served as the chair of one of the divisions of the National Research Council of the National Academy of Sciences. And I was pretty busy. I didn't have a chance to think about much else. But finally, in 2013, I do finally retire. And one of the first things that I happened to come across is an article in the Psych Review called The Coevolution of Knowledge and Event Memory. And when I read that paper, I was absolutely stunned. I think I called Rich within a few days to talk about it. And this model, this is another, maybe I'm claiming too much for the general theory, but this is another, and by the way, that's one of Ken's chapters on knowledge. This is a paper that really is quite amazing in the range of possibilities that it deals with. And what do I mean by that? It basically says, yes, you can build structures in memory of individual episodes, But there's also the possibility of recombining or combining several different episodes to generate a new item in memory. And that by combining some number of these over a long period of time, you build up a structure that's not unique to some particular episode, but is what one could call a knowledge structure. And the basic idea is pretty simple. You store one episodic memory in long-term store. The similar event occurs again, and you have another episodic memory of that event. You might put that into long-term store and have two separate memories, or you might have brought the original one back in and melded them together. And then there are other variations. And the idea of melding, using the short-term store, again, the short-term store comes in, of melding items together to build new knowledge structures is the basis on which one develops knowledge. Angela Nelson is one of Rich's PhDs. If you try to read that paper, I guarantee you may read it through, but you'll have to read it 4 or 5 times, and you'll probably end up reading each section somewhat separately because every sentence is something to deal with. The model's called SARC. You all probably know about it, storing and retrieving knowledge and events. At any event, Angela is actually here at UCSD as a lecturer, and I just think that this paper is one of the most important papers that I have ever read in psychology. I will go on, and I'm going to end fairly soon. After I read the Nelson Schifrin paper, I wrote a little paper called The Mind's Theorist. I probably should have never published it, but I had a former student who was starting a new journal in Colombia, South America. And he asked me if I would send him something. And I had this little piece that I had written for my personal interests, and I sent it on. Well, this is kind of a variation, not a very deep variation, but a variation on some of the ideas of Nelson and Schifrin, in addition to melding event episodes together to form memory structures. Here I talk about the idea of the short-term memory system trolling through long-term memory to find items that look similar to items that are in the troll queue search. And let's see if I can read it. Here it is. The basic component of the system for theory building is a process called trolling, when the conscious mind is not being bombarded by external stimuli or during certain stages of sleep. The mind's theorist trolls through memory, searching for traces that contain similar information. If several traces are identified, analysis may yield information that was not yet evident when each was examined individually. Reification of this sort can add new information to memory. So I like to, at this point, make the distinction between what I call acquired knowledge and created knowledge. And some of you may know that I've been a great critic of the SAT test, and I would use this distinction of acquired knowledge and created knowledge to talk about the problems of a test like the SAT. Well, that is pretty much it. When I first thought about this talk, I thought I'd really try to explain SAM and REM and SARC. I ended up really talking about the buffer. I'm really pleased that Ken's final chapter is going to go back to the buffer because it was interesting. Oh, the one point I haven't made, I don't think, is that, oh, it's good enough. I may have been a little haphazard in my remarks here, but if you're interested in really a very complete survey of the last 50 years, there is a wonderful paper that is an introduction to the volume in memory and cognition that is a collection of papers related to the general theory. And the last slide, Rich was out visiting recently, and this is our time together on a visit here. But I really want to remind you that we only had 3 years together. It was kind of a brief time. And then I disappeared entirely. But it's rather pleasant to be able to look back at this 57-year period. It's a long time, but it's been an incredible period. And I'm just pleased that I was part of the beginning. So that's it.
All right, thank you for that great talk. People are clapping, I'll show you that. You can't really tell otherwise. If anybody has any questions, go ahead and raise your hand. And Piot, oh, he's clapping, okay. That's a clapping symbol. I'll start with a quick question. Oh, yes, just a second here. Let's see if I can get this going. Yeah. My quick question is, a lot of the field still works on, careful with that water, works on a visual working short-term memory, basically. And I wonder how much thought you guys gave to that aspect.
There, I would refer you to chapter 2 of Ken Melberg's book. We'll have to ask Ken when he's going to have a draft in hand that people can look at. But he does these RSVP experiments. He combines those all in with the array of search and retrieval experiments and the SAM model and the REM model to provide an overview of that.
All right. Anybody else?
There's not much that I can say about specifics, so.
Good enough.
Thanks for listening. When I heard that this was going to be recorded, I said, yes, I'd do it because I want something to give to my grandchildren. There's a period in my life where I think I was very committed to scientific work. It was a sort of narrow period. It all ended in 1975. I really intended to get back to serious work. Bill Estes, while I was president of the university, Bill Estes said to me, Dick, when are you going to get back to serious work?
Well, I think you did serious work all along. You always amazed me. I'll just tell one story here. I'm sure he doesn't even remember, but there I was fairly early in my career. I published a paper in Psych Review, super proud of it. It's a Saturday, I'm at the pool with my young kids and my cell phone rings and it's Dick Atkinson. And he just read my paper and wants to argue a few points about it. I mean, I was like, that's amazing. Yeah, so I don't think he's ever completely backed out of following the scientific literature, but that was a really great historical overview of that model and related models since then. And yeah, you got something great to send to your.
Yeah, I spent a lot of time on the PDP-1, but it was really part of, and even the sense of a system and control processes. The title of the 68 paper was influenced by the nature of those times. And I want to comment a a side note. That system, the PDP-1 system, with all of those tentacles that I showed you, there's time sharing aspect of that. A key guy in the development of that, and part of the Institute for Mathematical Studies in the Social Sciences, was John McCarthy. I hope that strikes a familiar note. John McCarthy founded artificial intelligence. The early work around Lisp and the like was all done at Stanford right then in that very same period when Rich and I were working together.
All right, well, thanks again for that great talk. Thanks everybody for coming.
Thank you.
Can I ask a question? Can you hear me?
Yes.
Yes. Hey, yeah. Thank you for the talk. I put the question in the chat, but I think maybe it wasn't noticed. I was just wondering if you could comment a little bit on how to relate the psychological model with like more recent data on like neural data. For example, maybe like hippocampal replay and things like that. Do you have any? Yeah, just like a general comment, not a specific question.
You want to repeat that?
I don't know that I couldn't hear it.
He's basically asking about, the relationship to neuroscience.
Oh, there's a lot of discussion in Melberg's book about that. I'm just not up to getting into that at this point. Oh, I will remember them. I was at the Princeton conference when I introduced this concept of the buffer. A fairly famous neuroscientist said, "Well, Dick, I can't find the buffer. Where is it in the brain?" And Bill Estes said, "You don't understand. It's so tiny you can't see it." And obviously, the work of Milner's was very important in our moment in time, and she plays a very important role in all of that. It's interesting to me that, we actually have HM's brain here in UCSD in the brain bank. When I was director of NSF, one of the people working with him, one of the scientists who had a grant from NSF, brought him into NSF to meet me. And it was quite an interesting exchange, and it quite stunning in a way, the HM. And so that was very important for us in that period in time.
Elizabeth, do you have a question?
Thank you.
Oh yeah, I also posted a question in the chat. So it was just sort of what he was just talking about. It's a question in the Lashley tradition. It's where in the brain do you think that the buffer is embodied? Is it like connections between the parahippocampal region and the frontal cortex, for example?
I doubt he's going to have an answer for you on that.
Okay, all right, it's okay.
Yeah, you can.
I mean, there's an awful lot of discussion about that in the literature. I just would not be able to pull that discussion together.
You can see, though, from these questions, how much of the field has moved in the neuroscience direction.
Yeah, and that's great. I mean, what would be wonderful is the extent to which neuroscience could really place constraints on the kinds of models that we develop and the like. And again, this is a theory that I don't know what philosophers of science would say about the Atkinson-Shiffrin theory, but as soon as you step to the point of control processes, you have a pretty loose thing to try to pin down, if I make myself clear. I mean, we do not have a theory of how one puts together a control process.
Well, you neuroscientists can get to work on that. All right. Thank you again for a great talk. Thank you all for coming. We'll see you around.